On June 22, 1941, before sunrise, the sky over the eastern border was torn open by the sound of thousands of cannons. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. It wasn't just an attack, it was a human avalanche. More than 3 million German and Allied soldiers crossed the Soviet Union's border in 3 large army groups. The earth trembles beneath the tracks of panzer tanks. Luftwaffe planes swoop down from the sky like birds of prey, destroying Soviet airfields while they are still on the ground. Within hours, hundreds of enemy aircraft are burning on the runways. The first few days seem to confirm everything Berlin believed. Soviet divisions are surrounded. Thousands of prisoners march westward, exhausted, hungry and dazed. Roads are clogged with wrecked vehicles, bodies scattered among smoking craters. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, is at work again. Swift, brutal, overwhelming. The German officers repeat the promise with almost arrogant confidence. Before winter, we will be in Moscow. And in that hot summer of 1941, that statement seemed like a mathematical certainty. The soldiers march under the blazing sun, covered in dust. Some smile. Others write letters home saying the campaign will be quick, perhaps finished before Christmas. The propaganda reinforces the idea that the enemy is weak, disorganized, incapable of resisting German might. But while the maps show arrows advancing hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, something silent begins to grow, not on the battlefields, but in the arrogance of planning. The war was conceived as a summer campaign. The uniforms are lightweight, the boots are suitable for dry weather. Supplies include ammunition, fuel and rations, but no heavy coats, no thermal gloves and no lined winter boots. There is no significant stock of clothing appropriate for sub-zero temperatures, because nobody believed it would be necessary. The German leadership was convinced that the Red Army would collapse within a few months. The Soviet Union would fall before the leaves on the trees changed color. The Russian winter was seen as a distant detail, irrelevant, and that's where the illusion is born. As the soldiers advance ever deeper into enemy territory, supply lines stretch like fragile threads across a vast map. The distances across Russia are unlike anything they have ever faced. Villages seem endlessly separated. Roads are few, dusty, and makeshift. But in the summer, this doesn't seem to be a problem yet. The heat blankets the field with a false sense of control. The engines run perfectly. The machine guns fire flawlessly. The men march with energy, convinced they are participating in the greatest victory in modern history. They don't realize that every kilometer they gain takes them further away from safety. They don't realize that each day of progress brings them closer to an invisible enemy. They don't realize that the climate itself will become a weapon. And when winter finally arrives, it won't just be cold. It will be a sentence. The decision not to prepare for it, to ignore it completely, would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Men who marched confidently under the golden sun that summer would end up motionless in the snow months later, transformed into ice statues. But in June 1941, nobody thought about that. All they see is victory. Initially, everything seems to confirm German confidence. Cities fall in days. Soviet divisions are surrounded in gigantic pockets. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners march with their hands raised, exhausted, covered in dust. On the map, German arrows advance like blades cutting through flesh. But what the Germans don't immediately realize is that the enemy is retreating on purpose. The Soviet leadership adopted a brutal strategy. Nothing should fall intact into the hands of the invader. Under direct orders from Joseph Stalin, the scorched earth policy was initiated, and that changes everything. As the Germans advanced, they found villages burning, granaries destroyed, contaminated wells, bridges blown up seconds before the tanks arrived, train tracks ripped up and twisted like broken bones. The wheat fields, which were meant to feed the invaders, are set ablaze. The sky fills with black smoke. The smell of burning wood and grain mingles with the odor of gunpowder and flesh. German soldiers enter ghost towns. doors swaying in the wind, pots still hot on abandoned stoves, family photographs scattered on the floor. The population fled east, taking what they could carry. There is no food, there is no shelter, there is no comfort. The vast Soviet expanse is beginning to show its true face. Each kilometer gained means more distance from Germany, more fuel needed, more ammunition transported on fragile roads. Convoys stretch for dozens of kilometers, vulnerable to attacks and sabotage. Partisans, irregular fighters, emerge from the forests. They attack at night. They cut telephone lines. They ambush isolated trucks. The invader never knows exactly where the next shot will come from. War ceases to be merely a triumphal march. It's starting to turn into wear and tear. And there is something even more dangerous: time. Summer begins to slowly decline. The nights grow colder. The wind blows more sharply across the open plains. The soldiers do not yet feel the true winter, but they already realize that this land is unlike any other in Western Europe. The Soviet Union is not just retreating. She is pulling the enemy into an almost infinite space. For every city captured, there is another one further away. For every victory, a new line of resistance. For every advancement, there is a higher cost. And what's most unsettling, the Red Army doesn't collapse. Even after enormous losses, new divisions emerge. Young recruits, workers, peasants, all conscripted. Poorly trained, often poorly armed, but determined to resist. The German command still believes it's only a matter of time. But the devastated land beneath their feet begins to tell a different story. The invasion, which should have been swift, now depends on supplies that need to travel hundreds of kilometers across devastated territory. And when the weather changes, when the rains come, those fragile roads will turn into traps. No local food, without adequate shelter, not prepared for the cold. The German army continues to advance, but it already carries within it the seeds of disaster. And winter is getting closer and closer. Then summer ends, not with an explosion, but with a subtle change in the air. The heat dissipates, the sky grows heavy, and suddenly the rain begins. At first it seems like just a nuisance, then it turns into a nightmare. The Russians are well acquainted with this phenomenon. They call it Rasputitsa, the mud season. Twice a year, the earth seems to dissolve. And in 1941, it swallowed entire armies. Soviet roads are not like those in France or Belgium. Many are just dirt tracks. When the rain falls incessantly, the ground becomes a thick, sticky, deep mass. German trucks get stuck up to their axles. The tanks sink slowly, as if being pulled down by invisible hands. Horses, thousands of them, struggle to stay on their feet, slipping, breaking legs, and being slaughtered right there. Soldiers disembark from the vehicles and begin to push. Boots sink up to their ankles, then up to their shins. Each step requires strength. Every meter gained is a battle against the ground. It's not the enemy shooting. It is the earth itself resisting. The supply columns, which were already stretched too far, practically grind to a halt. Fuel isn't arriving. Ammunition is delayed. Rations are being rationed even further. The advance slows drastically. Officers look at maps and calculate distances that seem small on paper, but now take days to travel. Engines work at their limit, overheat, break down. Men spend hours trying to free vehicles stuck in the cold, constant rain. Meanwhile, the Red Army retreats in order, reorganizing defensive lines further east. Mud is not just a physical obstacle, it erodes trust. The promise of "we'll be in Moscow before winter" is starting to sound less like certainty and more like desperate hope. The soldiers feel the change in the weather. At night, the cold already bites their fingers. Light uniforms don't keep out the damp wind. Blankets get soaked. There's no way to dry clothes properly. And the worst is yet to come. Rasputitsa is merely the prelude. It traps the German army in place, delaying the schedule which depended on absolute speed. Every day lost in the mud is a day closer to the Russian winter. When the rains finally subside, the soil hardens again. But it's not the heat that's returning, it's the cold. The mud begins to freeze, and what once held the vehicles back now turns into ground as hard as stone. The advance begins again, but the men are already exhausted. The delay was enough. The time that should have been used to conquer Moscow was consumed by the mud. And on the horizon, invisible but inevitable, winter approaches like a white shadow. The real executioner has not yet shown his face, but he's coming. When the mud finally hardens under the increasing cold, the German army moves again with almost desperate urgency. Now every day counts. Every hour could mean the difference between victory or catastrophe. The objective is clear: Moscow. Taking the Soviet capital would not be merely a territorial conquest, it would be a devastating psychological blow. The political, railway, and symbolic heart of the Soviet Union would fall. Many believed this would force the collapse of the regime. In late September and early October 1941, the final offensive against Moscow began, known as Operation Typhoon. The name says it all: a storm. And at first it seems to work. Huge sieges are formed in Vyazma and Bryansk. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers are captured. The roads become congested with endless columns of prisoners marching under armed guard, many already weakened by hunger. The road to Moscow seems open, but seems is the key word. As the Germans advance, the resistance intensifies. It is no longer the disorganized retreat of the beginning of the invasion. It is a stubborn defense, layer by layer. Anti-tank lines are dug by civilians. Women and teenagers work with shovels in the biting cold, preparing trenches on the outskirts of the capital. Moscow is not waiting to fall. She's preparing to fight to the last man. And then the cold sets in. First 10 degrees C, then 20 degrees C. The engines begin to fail at dawn. Soldiers wake up to ice forming inside their tents. Their breath becomes a constant haze. The water in their canteens freezes overnight. The Germans can see the towers and domes of the capital in the distance. Some patrols report being less than 30 kilometers from the Kremlin. On clear days, they say it's almost possible to imagine the city's silhouette on the horizon, so close, and yet so distant. The divisions are exhausted. Equipment is worn out. Troops are operating below capacity. Confidence still exists, but now mixed with tension. It's no longer the triumphant march of summer. It's a race against time, and time is not on their side. The Red Army, reinforced by troops transferred from Siberia, men accustomed to extreme cold, begins to tighten its defenses. These units, equipped with appropriate clothing and trained for combat in glacial temperatures, represent a dangerous shift in the balance of power. The Germans feel it on the front lines. Resistance intensifies. Local counterattacks suddenly emerge. Soviet artillery explodes over newly conquered positions. Every village becomes a brutal battleground, and while the snow begins to fall lightly, almost innocently, many still believe that Moscow will fall in a matter of days. But winter hasn't completely set in yet. He is still gathering his strength. The capital lies before them, the ultimate prize of the campaign. But for the first time since June, victory no longer seems inevitable. She seems fragile, and the cold continues to descend. And then he actually arrives, not like a simple change of season, but like a merciless force. At the end of November 1941, the temperature plummeted drastically. It was no longer 10 degrees C or 15 degrees C. The thermometer dropped to 30 degrees C, then 35 degrees C. In some regions, it was close to 40 degrees C. Cold weather is not just about discomfort. He is destruction. Tank engines won't start in the morning. The oil freezes and turns into a thick paste. Batteries die during the night. Soldiers have to light fires under the engines to try to warm them up, making them easy targets for Soviet artillery. Machine guns jam, bolts jam. Cannons need to be disassembled to function. Steel, which once seemed indestructible, begins to crack under extreme temperatures. But the machines aren't the worst of it yet. The worst part is what happens to men. German soldiers lack adequate clothing. They still wear uniforms designed for a quick summer campaign. Some improvise, wrapping blankets around their bodies, stuffing newspaper into their boots to try to insulate against the cold, tying pieces of cloth around their hands. But none of that is enough. At night, the cold invades the trenches like a silent killer. It enters through the sleeves, the boots, the collar. It burns the skin. Then it numbs. Then it kills. Men wake up with numb fingers, white, hard as wood. Hours later, the fingers turn black, gangrene. What begins as a tingling sensation ends in amputation. Field medics work tirelessly, sawing off fingers, feet, sometimes entire legs. Not from gunshot wounds, but because the cold has killed the tissues. Some soldiers don't wake up. Sentinels are found dead, still standing, leaning against their rifles. Others seem to have simply fallen asleep in the snow. Death by freezing is silent. First comes the violent, trembling, then mental confusion, then a deceptive sensation of warmth, and then nothing. Winter is silent. He simply transforms living men into rigid bodies. Meanwhile, on the other side, Soviet troops seem to move with a different energy. They wear white padded coats, felt boots and thick gloves. They are used to that climate. They know how to survive in it. The difference now is stark. What was once a German offensive has now become a desperate struggle to simply keep functioning. Horses freeze overnight. Abandoned trucks lie scattered along the roads like metal skeletons. Weapons must be kept under the body while sleeping to prevent them from jamming in the morning. Cold weather doesn't discriminate based on patent. It affects privates and officers alike. The confidence of summer is gone. The promise of "we'll be in Moscow before winter" now sounds almost cruel. Winter has arrived, and Moscow is still resisting. For the first time since the start of the invasion, the German army is not advancing. He is surviving. And while the men struggle against the ice, the Red Army is preparing something. Cold weather isn't just suffering. He is setting the stage for the turnaround. Now the problem is no longer strategic. It's physical. It's human. German soldiers feel this firsthand. Literally. The uniforms they wear were designed for quick campaigns in Central Europe. Thin fabric, ordinary leather boots, simple gloves, nothing prepared for temperatures that destroy exposed flesh. In minutes. At first, there was still hope that the cold weather would be temporary, but he's not going away. They are intensifying. There simply aren't enough stockpiles of winter clothing. The German leadership never believed they would be needed. The campaign should have ended months earlier. Now, thousands of men are paying for that mistake. Soldiers begin to improvise as best they can. Blankets become capes fastened with ropes. Curtains torn from abandoned houses are wrapped around their legs. Pieces of felt are placed inside their boots. Some wrap their feet in rags before putting on the stiff, frozen leather. But the cold still gets in. The boots harden overnight. By morning, they feel like blocks of wood. To put them on, you have to bang them on the ground, forcing the frozen leather. Many can no longer feel their toes. Freezing doesn't hurt at first. He's deceiving. First comes the tingling, then the numbness, then the skin turns white. Next, bluish, and finally, black, dead. Meat. The field hospitals are starting to fill up, not with shrapnel wounds, but with victims of the weather. Lines of men await treatment with swollen feet, stiff hands, and necrotic ears. The sound of medical saws working echoes in the tents. Amputations are becoming routine. Meanwhile, on the other side of the lines, Soviet soldiers appear dressed in thick padded coats, fur hats, and lined boots. Many came from Siberia, accustomed to even more extreme temperatures. They move confidently on the ice. The Germans are trembling. Inequality is cruel. In the trenches, men try to sleep huddled together to share body heat. Small fires are lit with any available piece of wood, broken furniture, ripped off doors, even coffins found in villages. But bonfires also reveal political positions, and Soviet artillery shows no mercy. Every attempt at warming could cost lives. The cold begins to affect not only their bodies, but their minds. Soldiers become irritable, apathetic, and desperate. Some enter a state of mental torpor. Others experience hallucinations caused by hypothermia. War is no longer just against an armed enemy. It becomes a fight for survival itself. And the most devastating thing is, all of this could have been avoided with proper planning. The fault does not lie with the courage of the men on the front lines. He is arrogantly convinced that the campaign will end before winter arrives. Now, winter has not only arrived, he is judging, and the sentence is silent, white, and merciless. The cold was no longer an enemy. It was a silent executioner, a tormentor that seeped into the veins like invisible poison, stealing life drop by drop, cell by cell, without the clamor of a bullet or the roar of a grenade. In the winter of 1941, on the endless plains of Russia, the thermometer plummeted beyond imagination, 40, 50 degrees below zero, and the wind howled like a pack of hungry wolves, cutting exposed skin like sharp blades of ice. The German soldiers, once proud, conquerors of a blitzkrieg that had devoured half of Europe, now trembled like dry leaves under summer uniforms, thin as cigarette paper which the wind mercilessly pierced. The snow fell densely, relentlessly, covering everything in a white blanket that hid death with a treacherous beauty. During the endless nights, the sentries stood motionless at their outposts, their eyes fixed on the darkness that stretched like a bottomless abyss. The wind blew horizontally, carrying ice crystals that stung faces like needles. One man, perhaps a young man from Berlin who had dreamed of fleeting glories, felt the tremor begin, first in his fingers, then in his arms, a violent shaking his body imposed to generate heat. He gripped his rifle tighter, murmuring prayers or curses, trying to resist, but the cold was patient. It waited. Slowly the tremor gave way to profound exhaustion, a fatigue that seeped into the marrow of his bones. His treacherous mind began to fail. Then came that cruel illusion, a sudden, almost comforting warmth, as if his body in despair were lighting an internal fire. Some, in delirious panic, tore off their gloves, unbuttoned their coats, convinced they were overheated. "I'm burning!" they screamed into the void, before falling into eternal silence. It was the final mistake. Consciousness dissolved like snow in the sun, but there was no sun, only ice. In the morning, when the grey dawn barely managed to break through the icy fog, the comrades approached, for the changing of the guard. What they found were not men. They were statues, rigid figures still standing, rifles frozen in their clenched hands, eyes open and glazed, fixed on a horizon they would never see. Their skin, pale, looked like polished marble, their lips cracked and black, their eyelashes encrusted with frost. No cries echoed, no pleas for help, only the absolute silence of the cold that had stolen their lives without drama, without blood, without heroism. They seemed like sculptures carved by merciless nature itself, expressions frozen in a mixture of surprise and resignation, uniforms hardened like crystal armor, snow piled on their shoulders, and helmets like a funeral shroud that the wind molded with sadistic slowness. In open fields, the landscape transformed into a living cemetery. Bodies lay scattered where fate had abandoned them, some fallen face down, trying to push trucks stuck in the snow until their last breath, others still marching as if the next step could take them home, but paralyzed mid-movement. Others sat at the foot of skeletal trees, leaning as if resting from a long journey, hands in their laps, heads bowed. But they were not resting, they were dead. Dead from a death that robbed them of human dignity, transforming warriors into grotesque wax figures. The soil, hard as cast iron, made any dignified burial impossible. Pickaxes and shovels ricocheted without leaving a mark. The effort to dig even the smallest grave cost hours of sweat that instantly froze on their backs. Thus, the dead remained where they fell, an inseparable part of the white landscape. Among abandoned tanks, with frozen engines and tracks stuck in the ice, and trucks motionless like metallic skeletons, the rigid bodies blended into the scenery. A soldier marching alongside a comrade caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette and realized with a tightness in his chest that chilled more than the air that this man had been alive just days before. Now, he was merely a statue of horror, a reminder that the line between life and death was thinner than a hair. The psychological terror was devastating, a slow erosion of the soul that corroded sanity like acid. Marching alongside those icy ghosts meant confronting one's own fragility. A sleepless night, a patrol that stretched too far, a moment of carelessness lighting a cigarette, and winter would decide. Fear settled in deep, visceral. Soldiers awoke, startled, sweating despite the cold, dreaming of the approaching tremor, of the false warmth that would deceive them. Despair took hold in the trenches. Unfinished letters to mothers and fiancées were kept with trembling hands. Promises of "I'll be back for Christmas" transformed into cruel irony. Some slowly went mad, laughing for no reason, crying silently, or simply stopping talking, their eyes as empty as those of the standing dead. The war, which had begun as a symphony of steel and fire, was now a silent requiem, where death dressed in white and moved without sound. Meanwhile, the fighting raged on, merciless. The Red Army pressed on tirelessly, and the fresh snow covered the scars of battle, pools of blood that turned into black scabs, fragments of twisted metal, half-buried grenade casings. But beneath that immaculate whiteness lay the most terrible secrets. Frozen bodies, faces contorted in the last instant of panic, hands outstretched as if pleading for a warmth that would never come. The invasion, once an invincible storm, of steel, now dragged on like a dying, wounded man through a field of ghosts. And the cold, the cold had not yet finished its work. It reserved the worst for those who remained alive, the certainty that with each breath that formed icy clouds in the air, death whispered in their ear, "Tomorrow it could be you, or the day after, but it will come, silent, inevitable." While the Germans fought not against men, but against their own betraying bodies, against the air that burned their lungs, and against the fate that had condemned them to a white hell, the Soviet command, in the depths of underground bunkers heated by makeshift fires, saw an opportunity that history would record as an epic turning point. It was the beginning of December 1941, and the Battle of Moscow, which the invaders considered almost won, was becoming the tomb of their illusions. The Red Army launched its decisive response, not with the desperation of the besieged, but with the calculated fury of those who had waited for the perfect moment. And Germany, for the first time, was caught by surprise like a predator becoming prey. From the Far East, from the Siberian steppes where the cold was an age-old companion, came fresh divisions, trained for the icy apocalypse. Men with broad faces, hardened by winters that lasted half the year, accustomed to 40 degrees C as easily as breathing normal air. They wore white padded coats, perfect camouflage against the snow, thick felt boots, valenki, that kept their feet alive, where the Germans lost theirs, heavy sheepskin gloves, fur hats that covered their ears and necks. Some glided on silent skis, white ghosts in the whiteness. Others pulled sleds loaded with heavy machine guns, ammunition and supplies, moving with the fluidity of wolves on the hunt. They didn't fight the winter. They dominated it. They used it as a weapon. At dawn on December 5th and 6th, under a leaden sky where fine snow blew horizontally like a curtain of needles, Soviet artillery burst forth. The sound was deafening, continuous thunder echoing across the frozen plains, making the ice tremble beneath their feet. Thousands of cannons spewed fire and death, and soon the infantry advanced in coordinated waves, confident, shouting, "Hurrah!" that cut through the wind like blades. For the Germans, weakened to the core, it was a waking nightmare. Machine guns jammed in the extreme cold, the oil frozen in the gears, the bolts seized, the numb fingers unable to pull the trigger accurately. Cannons had to be hastily warmed with makeshift fires, but the effort cost precious minutes under enemy fire. Soldiers could barely feel their hands, their faces burned by the cold, cracked like porcelain, their feet, wrapped in rags, throbbed with black gangrene that climbed up their legs. The Soviets attacked village after village, exploiting the mobility that winter granted them as a divine gift. German units, with their numbers reduced to the skeletons of companies, exhausted by months of advance, hunger and freezing, yielded ground inch by inch. The feeling was devastating, a despair that gnawed at the soul like the cold gnawed at the flesh. Months before, in June, they were the hunters. They surrounded, advanced, crushed entire divisions with the fury of titans. Now they were the hunted. The retreat, under temperatures that turned the air into poison, was 1,000 times more cruel than the attack. Columns dragged themselves under constant fire, wounded men, groaning in makeshift sleds made of torn doors or ripped tarpaulins. When there was no longer the strength to carry them, they were abandoned by the roadside, pleading eyes following the comrades marching ahead, knowing that the cold would claim them in hours. Vehicles that refused to start, frozen engines, dead batteries, were left behind, monuments to the arrogance that had thought it would dominate Russia in weeks. The frozen ground was marked by trails of blood that quickly became dark. Stains beneath the fresh snow, like wounds that nature was trying to hide. Morale plummeted into a bottomless abyss. The promise of lightning victory, of parades in Moscow before Christmas, had evaporated like vapor in the icy air. The Soviet capital stood tall, proud and unwavering, and the enemy not only resisted, it counterattacked with renewed fury. The counteroffensive pushed the Germans back dozens, then hundreds of kilometers in entire sectors, from Klin to Kalinin, from Tula to Venev. The lines broke like thin ice. For the first time since the beginning of the invasion, the German war machine suffered a crushing strategic defeat. The myth of invincibility shattered with a crash, and the sound of that cracking echoed in hearts like the end of a feverish dream. In the midst of the chaos, winter continued its sadistic work, multiplying the suffering with each step of the retreat. Men already at their physical limit marched without feeling their feet, limbs blackened by gangrene that would detach days later. Faces burned by the cold became masks of eternal pain. Weapons weighed twice as much under layers of accumulated ice, as if the metal itself conspired against them. The terror was palpable. Each gust of wind brought the dread that it would be the last. Each abandoned village hid the possibility of ambush. Each night was a minefield of delirium and silent deaths. Despair gripped the ranks. Letters home were written with trembling fingers, confessing what was once unthinkable. We will not return as heroes. Perhaps we will not return. The war on the Eastern Front had ceased to be a glorious campaign of rapid conquest. It had transformed into an abyss of brutal survival, where each dawn was a victory against the impossible. And that winter, which had begun as an insurmountable obstacle for the invaders, became a decisive ally of the Red Army. The snow that blinded the Germans served as perfect camouflage for the Siberians, the cold that paralyzed German. Engines propelled Soviet skis. The ice that killed sentinels on their feet strengthened the resolve of the defenders. The invader realized, too late, with a terror that chilled the soul more than the air, that they were not only fighting against soldiers, they were fighting against an entire nation, united in patriotic fury, against a land that rose up as an ancestral avenger, and against nature itself, which had chosen its side. The counteroffensive was not merely military, it was cosmic. It was the cry of Russia saying, "You came as conquerors, you will leave as ghosts." And the cold, always the cold, whispered the epilogue. The winter of 1941 would not be remembered only for frozen bodies standing upright. It would be the tomb of an empire that dared to defy the impossible and lost. The war was no longer a struggle between armed men and opposing ideals. It was now a slow, intimate, almost obscene collapse, where the soldier's own body, the very tool of death he carried, turned against him like a rabid dog biting the hand that fed it. With the Soviet counteroffensive roaring like a human avalanche from the east, and the cold, that cold of 40, 50 degrees below zero, crushing bones and souls with the patience of an eternal executioner, the Germans faced not one, not two, but three implacable enemies: the Red Army, the Russian winter, and the most treacherous of all, their own equipment, once a sacred symbol of Germanic superiority. The MG-34 machine guns, queens of infernal rate of fire, those that had decimated entire ranks in Poland, France, and Ukraine, now fell silent in the most critical moments, as if the metal itself had decided to desert. The lubricating oil, once as fluid as warm blood, froze inside the delicate mechanisms, transforming gears into solid blocks of black ice. The bolt locked with a dry, definitive, irrevocable click. A soldier, perhaps a sergeant from Dresden who once boasted of German precision, knelt in the snow with fingers that no longer felt pain, only a dull throbbing of dead flesh, trying to disassemble the weapon with brittle fingernails. He blew hot steam from his mouth onto the metal parts, his breath forming clouds that crystallized instantly. He rubbed with dry cloths, tapped with the hilt of his bayonet, murmured prayers or blasphemies. Some, in utter despair, slept, clutching their rifles as if they were lovers, the meager warmth of their chests trying to prevent the steel from turning to stone. But the cold was stronger, always stronger. The artillery cannons, once a symphony of destruction, demanded humiliating rituals before firing. Bonfires lit around the muzzles, soldiers burning precious fuel rations just to thaw the recoil mechanism. Armored vehicles, the proud panzers that had torn through the steppe like hot knives through butter, refused to start. Hours of warm-up, numb hands turning cranks, engines coughing and dying like old asthmatics. And when, finally, the engine started with an agonizing roar, it was often too late. The enemy had already emerged from the white fog, shouting, "Hurrah!" like demons from the frozen hell. Sometimes the engine simply wouldn't start, never again. And when the weapon failed on the front lines, the consequence wasn't statistical. It was torn flesh, shattered skulls, lives cut short the very instant trust betrayed them. A young recruit pulled the trigger with his heart in his mouth, expecting the saving roar, and nothing, just the empty click, the silence, the face of the comrade beside him exploding in bright red against the whiteness. Men died looking at their own useless hands, at the MG-34 that had abandoned them, as if the equipment, that mechanical god of the Wehrmacht, had chosen the Soviet side. The psychological impact was a poison that spread faster than frostbite. The German soldier, raised in the unwavering belief of superior engineering, of a superior race, of a superior machine, now saw his faith crumble like snow in a non-existent sun. Confidence dissolved cell by cell, like feet necrotizing inside boots. Cases of frostbite exploded in numbers that medical reports barely dared to record. Entire companies transformed into makeshift field hospitals, feet black, swollen, smelling of rotting flesh. Hands that became useless claws, faces with noses and ears drooping like overripe fruit. Soldiers pleaded, cried, clung to their officers. "Don't send me back, Herr Leutnant. If they amputate, I'd rather die here." Others fainted mid-march, collapsing like dead trees, without a groan. Hunger tightened its grip. Supply lines stretched to their limit, rations arriving like blocks of ice that had to be melted in the mouth, burning the tongue. Water obtained by melting dirty snow, consuming what little fuel remained, leaving the men dehydrated, feverish and delirious. The mind followed the body in its fall. Morale, which in the summer of 1941 was high, arrogant, almost divine. Moscow in 4 weeks was now fractured, reduced to sharp shards that cut from within. In the shallow trenches dug in the ice, the conversations changed tone. They no longer spoke of lightning-fast victories, of parades in Red Square, of leave in Paris. They spoke of surviving the next dawn, of how long until the next attack, of letters that might never arrive. With each grey dawn, the formation had fewer men. Some disappeared into the night, swallowed by the cold. Others remained, but with dead eyes, souls already. Frozen, the horizon was an endless white void. The sky, an oppressive leaden ceiling. The enemy attacked and retreated like ghostly shadows, leaving behind only footprints that the wind erased. And the cold remained constant, immutable, implacable, a judge that accepted no appeal. The blitzkrieg, built on speed, surprise and mechanical power, was being dismantled piece by the weather, by the infinite distance of Russia, and by the resistance of a people fighting for their own land as if it were humanity's last battle. The German machine still creaked, still fired sporadically, still killed, but it no longer seemed invincible. It seemed like a wounded giant, staggering, bleeding, frozen oil and hope. And deep down, many soldiers, those who still dared to feel, were beginning to realize something they never imagined during those hot June days. They might not leave Russia alive. They could become just another ice statue by the side of the road. They could be forgotten under the snow, as if they had never existed. The moment arrived when holding the position was no longer courage, it was slow suicide. The German lines, stretched like violin strings about to snap, frozen to the core, pressed by seemingly endless waves of people, began to give way. It wasn't the orderly retreat of war manuals with maps, schedules and dignity. It was a forced, chaotic, desperate retreat under constant fire, under wind that cut like razors, under temperatures that killed with the same efficiency as tracer bullets. The order came late, and in many sectors, reluctantly, almost ashamedly, the leadership hesitated. To admit retreat was to admit that the Führer had erred, that the infallible plan had failed, that the Russian winter was greater than the Aryan will. But the reality on the ground screamed louder than any order from Berlin. To stay meant to die. Everyone, without exception. And so began the movement backward, an exodus of ghosts in grey uniforms. The frozen roads had become living nightmares, congested with a hellish mix of staggering infantry, damaged vehicles coughing up black smoke, artillery pieces being dragged by skeletal horses whose ribs looked like they were about to pierce their skin, makeshift ambulances made of torn tarpaulins and broken sleds. Every step was a mortal risk. Soldiers slipped on the black ice, fell with a thud, got up groaning, kept going. Some didn't get up. The snow, treacherous and merciful at the same time, covered them in minutes, turning warm bodies into anonymous white mounds. The wounded, oh the wounded, were the most heartbreaking sight. Placed in trucks that often refused to start, or that traveled mere kilometers before finally dying. When the engine failed, the most seriously injured were left behind, not out of cruelty on the part of the officers, but out of sheer physical impossibility. There weren't enough hands, there wasn't enough strength, there wasn't enough time. A captain might weep as he gave the order, but the order was given. The eyes of those abandoned remained etched in the memory of those who marched. Silent pleading, pure terror, the awareness that the cold would come to claim them in a few hours, slow, tender, and lethal. Behind the retreating columns, the sound of Soviet artillery echoed like the laughter of demons. A continuous boom, 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 each explosion spewing geysers of snow and frozen earth. The cold followed like a faithful and sadistic companion, constant, omnipresent, whispering in every man's ear. Many marched without feeling their feet, limbs transformed into pieces of dead wood banging against the ice. Others wrapped their faces in filthy cloths, protecting noses and cheeks that were already beginning to blacken. Their beards turned into a crust of hard ice, their eyebrows white fringes that weighed like lead. The exhaustion was total, absolute, cosmic. Men walked in a trance, eyes glazed, moving like broken automatons, their minds dulled by days without sleep, without hot food, without hope. Along the roads that stretched like open veins in the flesh of Russia, bodies piled up like macabre landmarks. Men fallen face down, their hands still clenched on useless rifles. Horses collapsed amidst their harnesses, glazed eyes, vapor escaping from their nostrils until their last breath. Abandoned vehicles formed a graveyard of twisted iron. Tanks with tracks stuck in the ice, overturned trucks, cannons fallen like exhausted soldiers. The landscape seemed frozen in time, a picture painted by the devil himself. And then there were the statues, dead soldiers who seemed alive, lying as if sleeping a deep, well-deserved sleep, sitting leaning against truck wheels, heads slumped on their chests, some with open eyes, fixed on the grey, indifferent sky, as if still awaiting orders. There was no time to bury them. The ground was pure steel, pickaxes ricocheted as if striking granite, and so they remained, monuments to shattered illusion. The question echoed in every mind, in every dragging step, in every breath that formed clouds of ice. Retreat, but where to? The Russian vastness offered no shelter. Each new, improvised defensive line had to be dug into the ice with fingernails and desperation. Each new position demanded energy that the men no longer possessed. The army that had crossed the border in June with gleaming tanks, waving flags and victory songs now crawled backward like a wounded animal, bleeding, freezing, leaving a trail of corpses that the snow tried to erase. The retreat wasn't just geographical, it was psychological. It was the definitive end of the illusion, the silent, almost sacred in its bitterness, recognition that the war on the Eastern Front would not be quick, would not be glorious, would not be won. It would be long, brutal, relentless, a mill of flesh and steel that would grind down entire generations. And winter was not yet over. It continued to exact its toll, man by man, soul by soul, kilometer by kilometer, with the patience of those who know that time and the cold are always on their side, and that, in the end, Russia always wins. Always. Every great offensive, every triumphal march that dreams of engulfing continents, depends on one brutally simple, almost prosaic thing: supplies, fuel to move the tanks that devour kilometers, ammunition to feed the machine guns that reap lives, food to keep the soldier's body from collapsing, spare parts to repair what the enemy, or time, breaks. Without it, the most powerful army in the world, the war machine that terrorized all of Europe, transforms in the blink of an eye into a band of armed, hungry, frozen men, waiting for the inevitable with the empty eyes of those who already know that death will come slowly, silently, dressed in white. And in the winter of 1941, that German logistical machine, once the pride of engineers who considered themselves gods, began to collapse, not with a bang, but with an agonizing creak, a metallic sigh that echoed for thousands of kilometers across the frozen steppe. The Russian distances were living monsters, infinite, devouring, endless. From Berlin to Moscow were more than 2,000 kilometers of nothing, plains, forests, frozen rivers that looked like white oceans. The Soviet railway tracks had a different, wider gauge, a technical heresy that forced the Germans to convert every kilometer of track before using it. Each conversion took precious days, entire weeks, time that the cold voraciously stole. Trains stopped in the snow, locomotives frozen like statues, wagons loaded with ammunition that would never reach the front because the tracks remained wrong. The trucks, the famous Opel and Mercedes that were supposed to be the lifeblood of the Blitzkrieg, traveled on frozen, poorly maintained roads, full of potholes that the ice disguised as traps. Tires hardened until they were as fragile as glass and burst under the mere weight of the load. Engines seized in. The extreme cold, radiators exploded when the water inside them froze and expanded like a silent bomb. At night, the vehicles were abandoned in endless rows, headlights off, like an army of mechanical ghosts. Fuel became liquid gold, more valuable than human gold. There were cruel cases, decisions that tore at the souls of the officers. Which unit would remain mobile? Which would be sacrificed? Left behind with immobile tanks, silent cannons, men who knew the Red Army would arrive in a few hours? The choice was made in whispers with trembling hands, eyes that avoided each other's. The tanks, living symbols of relentless advance, now stood motionless, transformed into makeshift bunkers of frozen iron. Crews slept inside them, clinging to the cold engines, trying to steal a last vestige of warmth. When the fuel finally ran out, some commanders, with tears freezing on their faces, ordered them to be blown up. The roar echoed across the plain, a funeral pyre of steel and fire that illuminated the snow for seconds before the cold extinguished everything again. The artillery suffered the same cruel fate. Horses, thousands of them, frozen to death standing up or collapsed from exhaustion, ribs protruding, eyes bulging with terror. Without horses, the cannons were left behind, half buried in the snow, muzzles pointed to the sky as if pleading for mercy that would never come. The cold also attacked the invisible, rails that contracted and cracked, telephone cables that hardened and broke at the slightest touch, radio equipment that failed because the batteries died in minutes. Messages were delayed for days. Orders arrived too late or never arrived at all. One battalion received instructions to advance when it was already surrounded. Another was ordered to resist when retreat was the only salvation. The perfect coordination that had made Blitzkrieg a deadly symphony was now a fragmented, slow, disorganized chaos, like a giant clock whose gears froze one by one. The soldiers felt it in their flesh. Rations arrived like hard stones, frozen in blocks impossible to chew. They had to be broken with the butt of a rifle, the splinters cutting already cracked lips. Water only existed by melting dirty snow on their helmets, consuming what little fuel remained, leaving the men even more dehydrated, feverish, and delirious. A malnourished body felt the cold 1,000 times more cruelly. Each degree below zero penetrated deeper. Each tremor consumed the last reserves of energy. Men grew thin until their bones showed beneath their bluish skin. Eyes sank into their sockets. Mouths murmured delirious words about hot bread, hot soup, a warm home. Meanwhile, the Red Army fought at home. Its supply lines were short, intimate, like veins connected directly to the heart of the homeland. Soviet industry had been evacuated beyond the Urals, to factories the Germans could never reach. Trains arrived day and night, bringing new tanks, fresh ammunition, warm and fed men. The balance tipped slowly, inexorably. The German logistical collapse was not a dramatic event, with explosions and white flags. It was silent, insidious, cumulative. One day you realized there were no more parts to repair the engine. Another day that the fuel was barely enough to move a company. Yet another that the men were eating snow because the food had run out. Germany still had determined men, experienced officers, and weaponry that, when it worked, still killed. But the machinery that held everything together was breaking down, creaking, stopping. And when logistics fail in a war of this titanic scale, the result is not just defeat, it's devastation. It's the end of a dream of conquest. The campaign that should have lasted weeks, months at most, was turning into an abyss that would consume years, millions of lives, entire generations. All because, in the summer of 1941, someone in Berlin believed that the Russian winter didn't matter, that Russia would be like France, that the cold was just weather, and the cold laughed, silently. In the midst of that white chaos, that snow that swallowed tanks and hopes, that death that arrived silently, there still existed something profoundly, painfully human. The letters, small pieces of paper carefully folded, kept in the inside pocket of a coat, close to the heart, where the little remaining body heat could protect them. Inside ice-covered backpacks, among frozen ammunition and rations, were words destined for mothers, wives, children, fiancés, voices that tried to cross thousands of kilometers of hell to say, "I am alive, I still think of you, I'll be back soon." Many never arrived. They were found weeks or months later, alongside stiff bodies, frozen standing or fallen in the snow like broken dolls. Some began with the naive hope of summer. "Dear mother, don't worry. Everything is going well. We are advancing quickly. The Russians are fleeing. We will be in Moscow before Christmas. My beloved, it's very cold here, but nothing a good German coat can't handle. Kiss the children for me. I'll be home soon." Words written under the warm June sun, when victory seemed certain, when war was still adventure and glory. Now those same letters were tragic relics, found in the clenched hands of the dead, the paper hardened by ice, the ink blurred by tears that froze before falling. There were chilling accounts, soldiers found with their pencils still between their numb fingers, letters interrupted. Mid-sentence, "It's so cold today I can barely write, but I want you to know that I love you and that..." And then eternal silence. Winter gave no warning. It didn't allow for a period. It simply interrupted life as if blowing out a candle. One man wrote about the son who would be born in spring. Another promised to bring a silk scarf from Moscow. Yet another confessed a fear he had never admitted aloud. And it stopped, forever. Comrades in arms, as they searched the dead before marching on, because it was always necessary to march on, collected those letters with trembling, almost reverent hands. Some tried to send them, even knowing that the mail was a distant dream. Others kept them in their own pockets, as if carrying the friend's last farewell was a way of keeping him alive for a few more days. They were relics of a broken promise, the promise of return, of hugs, of laughter around the table at a Christmas that would never come. Each letter was an entire interrupted universe, dreams of marriage, farm plans, memories of warm days in Bavaria or Prussia. As the retreat dragged on and the Soviet counteroffensive pressed in like a black tide, the battlefield filled not only with bodies, but with interrupted stories. Each frozen soldier was not just a grey uniform, a number on a casualty list. He was a father who had taught his son to ride a bicycle, a son who had promised to take care of his widowed mother, a brother who dreamed of returning to his younger sister. Winter turned them into ice statues, their expressions fixed with surprise or resignation, but it did not erase the fact that they had dreams, fears, loves. They were men who laughed at silly jokes, who cried secretly at night, who wrote "I love you" in crooked, cold letters. The brutality of the Eastern Front went far beyond physical violence. It struck at the deepest part of humanity, the emotional, what remained of the soul. The survivors carried the guilt like an open wound that never healed, the guilt of having remained alive while the friend beside them turned to stone. They carried the memory of those left behind in the snow, of those open eyes that seemed still to look at them. And when spring finally arrived, cruel in its beauty, and the ice began to melt, many bodies would reappear, swollen, disfigured, still with letters in their pockets, now legible again. The melting snow revealed the full extent of the tragedy, endless rows of the dead, like an army that never marched home. But in that winter of 1941-42, everything was still covered in white, silent, cold, and full of voices that would never be heard again. Voices trapped on paper, frozen in time, whispering forever what the world never knew. I was here, I loved, I was afraid, and the cold took me before I could say goodbye. And the snow fell relentlessly, covering everything, bodies, letters, hopes, as if Russia itself wanted to erase forever the marks of those who dared to invade it. When the snow began to fall that winter of 1941, no one imagined that it would cover not only fields and roads, but statistics that would change the course of the war. The German casualties that winter were devastating. Hundreds of thousands of men out of combat, tens of thousands dead, many others mutilated by freezing. They were not only victims of Soviet artillery or enemy bullets, they were victims of the weather. It is estimated that during the winter of 1941-42 alone, more than 100,000 German soldiers suffered severe frostbite injuries. Many lost fingers, others lost entire hands, some lost feet, legs. An entire army began to fall apart, not only from the fighting, but from the physical inability to continue. Divisions that had crossed the border with thousands of men were now operating with fractions of their original strength. Entire companies were reduced to small, exhausted groups. And that's without counting the dead who remained under the snow, not immediately accounted for. The impact went beyond the numbers. The myth of German invincibility, built in Poland, France, and the Balkans, began to crumble on the frozen plains of the Soviet Union. Blitzkrieg, which relied on speed and concentrated force, was slowed down to almost a standstill. Winter didn't just destroy bodies, he shattered the illusion. The German leadership realized, too late, that it had underestimated three fundamental things: the Soviet territorial dimension, the enemy's mobilization capacity, and the brutal power of the Russian winter. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Soviet Union survived what should have been a fatal blow. Moscow did not fall. The government remained. Industry continued producing. The war that was supposed to end in months was now only just beginning, and the human cost of this strategic error was paid by ordinary men, frozen in trenches, abandoned on icy roads, transformed into white shadows on the battlefield. The winter of 1941-42 was not just a difficult season, it was a turning point. From that point on, Germany would no longer fight a campaign of rapid conquest. She would enter a war of attrition, a war that would demand everything, and that would bring even more death. When spring began to threaten the ice, one thing was already clear: Germany had not won. Moscow remained standing. The Soviet government had not fled. The red flag still flew over the Kremlin. The operation that was supposed to destroy the Soviet Union in a few months had failed. And this failure completely changed the course of the war. The winter of 1941-42 was not just a tactical setback, it was a strategic shock. For the first time, the German army suffered a major, large-scale defeat in World War II. The aura of invincibility built up in Western Europe began to crack. German generals realized something that few dared to say aloud. The war in the East would not be quick. It would be long, brutal, exhausting. The Soviet Union demonstrated that it could lose millions of men and continue fighting. It demonstrated that it could retreat hundreds of kilometers and reorganize its forces. It demonstrated that winter was a weapon it knew how to use better than any other country. From that moment on, the conflict on the Eastern Front ceased to be a lightning offensive and became a war of attrition, a gigantic struggle for territory, resources, and survival. Months later, the world would witness even bloodier battles, such as the Battle of Stalingrad, where the German army would suffer an even greater disaster. But the seed of this turning point was planted there, in the winter off Moscow. The miscalculation was fatal, underestimating the enemy, underestimating the climate. To underestimate the resilience of a people fighting for their own land. Winter didn't win the war alone, but he disrupted Germany's rhythm. He broke their trust. His advance machine broke down, and above all, it showed that victory was not guaranteed. From then on, each new German offensive would carry the weight of that lesson frozen in the snow. The war had changed, and it would become even bloodier. When we think about that winter, we shouldn't see it merely as a weather event. He was a silent executioner. It transformed young men who crossed the border full of confidence in the summer into rigid figures scattered across the white plains. Many remained for months under the snow, preserved like natural sculptures, until the thaw revealed the extent of the tragedy. The image is hard to forget. Rifles still in hand, helmets covered in ice, eyes wide open, staring at a grey sky that never answered. The winter of 1941-42 taught a brutal lesson about strategic arrogance. It showed that war is not just about tanks and divisions. It's about logistics, planning, and respect for reality. Nature doesn't negotiate. No advertising is accepted. He's not impressed by previous victories. On the Eastern Front, it wasn't just man against man. He was a man against the climate, against the distance, against one's own physical limits, and many couldn't bear it. The title of this story is no exaggeration. Men really did become statues, not by choice, not through romantic heroism, but because the cold robbed them of their last breath of warmth. And so ended the first winter of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, not with the fall of Moscow, not with a victory parade, but with a silent field covered in snow and thousands of soldiers who would never return home. When we look at that winter of 1941-42, we're not just talking about snow, ice, and impossible temperatures. We're talking about the moment when arrogance reached its limits. Germany crossed the Soviet border, believing it was writing the final chapter of the war in the East. Tanks advanced like a storm. Planes dominated the skies. Millions of men marched, convinced that the enemy would fall before the cold arrived. But the cold weather arrived, and he didn't ask for permission. He froze the engines. He froze the weapons. He froze human flesh. It transformed soldiers into silent statues scattered across the vast white expanse of Russia. There, before Moscow, something greater than an offensive failed. It was the myth of invincibility that shattered. The blitzkrieg died under the snow. The promise of swift victory dissolved in the biting wind of the steppes. Winter did not fight alone. The Red Army resisted with brutal courage, but it was winter that bought time. It was winter that broke the rhythm. It was winter that proved that no war machine, however powerful, can ignore reality. And so, in that icy silence, a new phase of the war was born. A war of attrition, from prolonged suffering, of even bloodier battles to come. When spring finally arrived and the ice began to melt, it revealed what winter had hidden, thousands of bodies, reminding the world that nature can be as lethal as any army. That is the real lesson of that winter. It wasn't just one season. That was the moment when the war changed course, the moment when men stopped being conquerors and they became victims of their own mistake. On the Eastern Front, defeating the enemy was not enough. It was necessary to survive the winter, and that year, winter won.